Judges chapter 7, we're picking up where we left off. Gideon is about to go to battle, sent by the Lord as the people had cried out to God and turned back to him. It says in chapter 7, early in the morning, Gideon and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Morah. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men." He said, "You have too many soldiers. You have too much going for you." Basically, this is what God says. I love it. He says, "I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me that their own strength has saved them." So basically, God says, I want Israel to know that it's the hand of the Lord that rescued them. I need you to thin the crowd. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. Then the Lord looks at Gideon and he says, still too many. Take them down to the water and I will thin them out from there. If I say, this one shall go with you, he shall go. But if I say, this one shall not go with you, he shall not go. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap the water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank from cupped hands, lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. Verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, with these 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and trumpets of the others. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During that night, the Lord said to Gideon, get up, go down against the camp, because I'm going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp. So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. The Midianites, the Amalekites, and all the other eastern people had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. They were a vast enemy. Verse 13, Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. I had a dream, he was saying. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed. His friend responded, this can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands. Gideon is listening, and the enemies of Israel are having dreams that are terrifying them. They know that Gideon's coming, and they know that God is with him. Verse 15, when Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down in worship. He returned to the camp of Israel and called out, get up. The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands. Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Watch me, he told them, follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout for the Lord and for Gideon. Gideon and the 300 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew their trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed their jars, grasping the torches in their left hands and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying out as they fled. When the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with swords. Incredible picture. How God can turn the enemy to turn on itself. One thing about this world that I've noticed thousands of years later is that sin always turns on sin. Evil always turns on evil. The enemy always turns on the enemy. God is causing the enemy to begin to fight and contest with itself. The army fled to Beth Shattah toward Zerah, as far as the border of Abel Meholah near Tabith. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth Barah. So all the men of Ephraim were called out, and they seized the waters of the Jordan as far as Beth Barah. They also captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb. They killed Oreb at the rock of Oreb and Zeb at the winepress of Zeb. They pursued the Midianites and brought the heads of Oreb and Zeb to Gideon, who was by the Jordan. God went before Israel, and they defeated the enemies who had oppressed them. 300 men supernaturally defeated thousands upon thousands. Chapter 8. Now the Ephraimites asked Gideon, "Why have you treated us like this? Why didn't you call us when you went to fight Midian?" And they challenged him vigorously. He had just won this great victory. God had gone before him, and one of the tribes began to challenge him and said, "Why didn't you include us the way we felt we should have been included?" But he answered them, "What have I accomplished compared to you? Aren't the gleanings of Ephraim's grapes better than the full grape harvest of Abiezer? God gave Oreb and Zeb, the Midianite leaders, into your hands. What was I able to do compared to you?" At this, their resentment against him subsided. Gideon and his 300 men, exhausted, yet keeping up the pursuit, came to the Jordan River and crossed it. He said to the men of Succoth, "Give my troops some bread. They are worn out, and I am still pursuing Zebah and Zalmunna, the kings of Midian." But the officials of Succoth said, "Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your troops?" They wouldn't help him. So Gideon replies, "Just for that, when the Lord has given Zebah and Zalmunna into my hand, I will tear your flesh with desert thorns and briars." Verse 8. From there he went up to Peniel and made the same request of them. But they answered as the men of Succoth. So he said to the men of Peniel, "When I return in triumph, I'm going to tear down your tower." No one would help him, but he kept pursuing. Verse 10. Actually, I want to stop there for a second, because sometimes in life we can be doing something that God has called us to do, and we can be looking at people that are around us that we feel should be helping us accomplish what God has called us to do, but sometimes we can find resistance from the very people that we should be receiving help. And Gideon is facing resistance in a moment where he should be receiving assistance. But instead of allowing that to discourage him and defeat him, he continues to press on to what God has called him to do. The picture for you and for me is this: we need to continue to press on to what God has called us to do. Paul would put it this way: to press on towards the upward call, the heavenly call of Christ Jesus. I believe it was in Philippians. Verse 10, now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor with a force of about 15,000 men. All that were left of the armies of the eastern peoples. 120,000 swordmen had fallen. Catch this. 120,000 had fallen. 300 people caused 135,000 people to flee. This was only God. This wasn't Gideon. This was God. The Bible tells us that the two kings of Midian fled, but he pursued them and captured them, routing their entire army. Gideon, son of Joash, then returned from the battle by the pass of Heres. He caught a young man of Succoth and questioned him, and the young man wrote down from the names of the 77 officials of Succoth, the elders of the town. Then Gideon came and said to the men of Succoth, "Here are Zebah and Zalmunna, about whom you taunted me by saying, 'Do you already have the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna in your possession? Why should we give bread to your exhausted men?' He took the elders of the town, and he taught the men of Succoth a lesson by punishing them with desert thorns and briars. He also pulled down the tower of Peniel and killed the men of the town." Then he asked Zebah and Zalmunna, "What kind of men did you kill at Tabor?" "Men like you," they answered, "each one with the bearing of a prince." Gideon replied, "These were my brothers, the sons of my own mother. As surely as the Lord lives, if you had spared their lives, I would not kill you." Turning to Jether, his oldest son, he said, "Kill them." But Jether did not draw his sword, because he was a young man and he was afraid. Zebah and Zalmunna said, "Come do it yourself. As is the man, so is his strength." So Gideon stepped forward and killed them, and took the ornaments off their camels' necks. The enemies of Israel had been defeated. The kings of the enemies of Israel had been defeated. Israel was at peace. The Bible then closes off with the story at the end that we need to really pay close attention to. It said that the Israelites looked to Gideon and said, "Rule over us, your sons, your children, because you saved us from the hand of Midian." But Gideon told them, "I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." Great. Awesome. Awesome reply, Gideon. But he said this: "I have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." They answered, "We will be glad to do so." So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from his plunder into it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels. That math ends up being around 43 pounds. That's And it says, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, the purple ornaments worn by the king of Midian, or the chains that were on the camels' necks. That's a lot of money. 43 pounds of gold, 16 ounces. I don't know, that's 5 to 600 ounces. Right now, today's economy, it's about $2,000 an ounce. So we're sitting there talking probably about $1 million in today's economy worth of gold, give or take. This is a lot of gold. But verse 27 says that Gideon took this gold and he made an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah his town, and all Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there. And it became a snare to Gideon and his family. He had freed, by the hand of the Lord, Israel from the enemies of Israel. And the reason they were in that situation was because they were worshiping idols and not God. God uses him in a mighty way. He takes the rewards of what God had done in his life, and he makes an idol. It's crazy. And the Bible says to you and to me, as a warning, that it became a snare to him and his family. We need to be so careful that when God blesses us, we don't use the blessings of God in an unhealthy way. It can become a snare for us in our family. Verse 28, your heading will say Gideon's death. Thus Midian was subdued before the Israelites and did not raise its head again. During Gideon's lifetime, the land had peace for 40 years. Jerubbaal, son of Joash, went back home to live. He had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name was Abimelech. Gideon, son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Bezrites. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to Baal. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. They failed to show any loyalty to the family of Gideon, in spite of all the good things he had done for them. So once again, even though God had rescued them, even though God had saved them, even though God had provided for them, they turned their back on God. In the next chapter, we're going to learn about the consequences of their choices and how even when we are faithless, here's the New Testament principle in 2 Timothy, that even when we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Be blessed today.